Okay, let's get going. So thank you very much for everybody joining this afternoon's UKKW webinar, having a look at abstract writing. So my name's Lisa Ancliffe. I'm an occupational therapist at the Royal Free in London and also clinical vice president of the UKKW. We've got a great panel of expert speakers with us this afternoon. We're going to introduce them as we go through the presentation. If we go to the next slide. So just to get started with a little bit of housekeeping. So I'm not sure if you've got control over your mute or not, but just stay on mute during the presentation. There'll be time for questions to all the panel members at the end, and hopefully we'll have a good chunk of time there. So please use the chat function throughout the presentation to write any questions, and we'll pick them up at the end. Also, just to say that we do have a lot of content, a lot of slides here to go through. Some of it we are going to skip through quite quickly in the interest of time, but there is going to be a recording of the webinar and the slides are going to be available as well. So don't stress too much about trying to get down all the detail. You will be able to watch it back and access it later. Just in terms of what we're trying to achieve today. So really, we just wanted to give everybody some support and guidance on how to put together an abstract, really. We know that there's lots of really great work that's happening out there across the UK, and we want to help people being able to put that into a form, to be submitting it to various conferences, to be able to showcase what they're doing. We also just want to have a look at the different types of abstracts. So it's not one size fits all, and depending on the type of work you're doing, so science versus clinical versus quality improvement, qualitative, there's slightly different things that you might be looking at and how you present your work. So we just want to give some guidance on the different types of abstracts. Another thing that we want to look at is AI. So obviously coming into this brave new world, AI is becoming more and more part of our lives. So it's not to say don't use it, but it's looking to see how you can best incorporate it into your work safely. Hopefully increasing everybody's confidence in seeing themselves able to be putting through abstracts. It's something that anybody at any point of their career is able to do. And we also want to get some feedback from you as well and find out what else would be helpful to know so we can have a think about future resources. So I'm going to hand over to my co-chair now, Dane, to get us started.
Thank you. So my name is Dane Howard. I'm a renal and liver transplant pharmacist at St James's Hospital, Leeds. So first off, let's talk about what makes a good abstract, because in many cases, it's the only part of your work that most people will ever read. Think about it like this. Your title and abstract to the front door to your research. They form the first impressions for any potential reader, whether that's a journal editor, a reviewer, or someone skimming through conference proceedings. If these two elements don't capture their attention or clearly communicate the essence of your work, the reader is unlikely to read any further. But it's more than just about making a strong first impression. Your abstract also determines how discoverable your work is. In a world where researchers are flooded with information, the abstract is often the text that gets indexed in search engines, database, and repositories. If your abstract's vague, filled with jargon, or lacks key terms, it won't show up in search results, even if it's exactly what someone's looking for. And third, your abstract plays a major role in influencing decisions. So will someone choose to attend your conference talk? Will they download your article? Will a reviewer be intrigued or disinterested? That decision is often made entirely based on the abstract. So what should a good abstract do? It should be a standalone story. That means someone who only reads your abstract without access to your full paper or your live presentation should still be able to understand the core of your research. Specifically, your abstract should clearly and concisely communicate 4 things. What you did, give the reader a basic sense of your methods or approach. Don't just say we explored X, say how you explored it, why it matters, what's the significance of your work, why should anyone care, what's novel about it, is there something new here, is it a new method that you've used, a new question, or any surprising result, and what you found. So don't leave the reader hanging. Briefly summarize your key findings or conclusions. Think about your abstract as an elevator pitch. You've got just a few sentences to explain the essence of your research in a way that's accurate, compelling, and accessible. Next slide, please. Now that we understand the purpose of a good abstract and why it matters so much, let's break down what makes one effective and, just as importantly, what to avoid. So first, the purpose of an abstract is straightforward. It's a concise summary of your research. That means it should clearly state the purpose of your study, the methods that you used, your key findings, what's novel about your work, and the conclusions that you've drawn. A good abstract distills your entire research project in just a few sentences. So some of the core qualities every abstract should have: it must be clear and concise, no extra words, no jargon that obscures your message. It should follow a logical structure, often mirroring the structure of a paper. So introduction, methods, results, and discussion. Readers should be able to easily follow the flow of your thinking. If you need to clearly state the novelty, what's new or important about your research, and why does that matter? And finally, make sure your abstract aligns with any submission criteria. For example, if you're submitting to UK Kidney Week, check their specific requirements. They might expect certain formats, word limits, or content emphasis. On the flip side, there is some common pitfalls to avoid. Don't include too much background. It's not a literature review, so focus on your results. Avoid leaving any of your novelty unclear. If the reader can't tell what's new or different, they may lose interest. Be cautious about being too vague. Abstracts must be specific, even though they are short. And finally, poor structure can really sink a good idea. If your abstract jumps around or feels disjointed, readers may miss the point entirely. We've also got a few additional considerations that can enhance the visibility and impact of your abstract. So use keywords strategically. Think about the terms someone might search for when looking for research like yours. This helps with indexing and discoverability. And consider following Equator guidelines. Now, these help researchers summarize essential information from all parts of a study and ensures consistency and completeness. Now, Equator stands for Enhancing Quality and Transparency of Health Research. This initiative provides a library of reporting guidelines tailored to different types of health research studies. For example, you might use Consort for randomized controlled trials or Strobe for observational studies. And I think a few of the slides later on go into these in a bit more detail. And finally, when submitting to a conference or a journal, upload your most impactful visuals or tables as supplemental material. A well-designed figure can quickly communicate quite a lot of your main findings more effectively than text can. So that's the end of my first couple of slides. I'd like to introduce Laura Denby, who's going to speak to us about abstracts for basic science next.
Hi everybody, my name's Laura Denby and I'm a reader at the University of Edinburgh, and within the UKKA I'm the chair of the Laboratory Scientists Research Committee, and I'm also on the programme committee for UK Kidney Week. So as a scientist, we're often summarising or thinking about investigating biological, chemical or physiological mechanisms. Principally, we use laboratory-based models. This might be cell culture, preclinical animal studies, molecular assays, or occasionally patient samples. And when we're thinking about writing our abstract, these are often focused on underlying processes or mechanisms rather than immediate clinical application. And the work that we're doing is providing foundational knowledge that will later inform upon translation or clinical work. And we think about the types of basic science. Basic science is quite a broad word, and there's nothing really basic about it. Essentially, we have different types. We have fundamental science. This might be that you're only interested in a particular cell or enzyme or a particular gene in the genome. We also have something more like discovery science. This is where we quite often apply methodology that actually results in lots and lots of data being produced, and might have more of a computational or bioinformatic part to it. And then we also might move into sort of preclinical translation. That might mean that we've discovered a mechanism that we think is attractive for targeting for a therapy, and we might test this out in preclinical animal models. So very much we expect our focus of our abstracts to be on the underlying biological, chemical or physiological mechanisms. Therefore, for the ones that can, we expect there to be a clearly defined hypothesis that you will then test, and you will provide statistical analysis as to whether or not your hypothesis held up or not, or the probability, in fact, that your hypothesis is true. And you will use an experimental system or model in order to test your hypothesis. But as I said above, before, there are also discovery types of scientific studies whereby you apply a particular methodology. This could be an example of next generation sequencing, or sequencing the genome. This will give you lots and lots of data, and it may not have a specific hypothesis at the beginning, and we call these studies hypothesis generating studies. These are slightly different, but they should again have a clearly defined aim and objective that's within the abstract. What we're looking for in terms of the abstract is very clear methodology. So how did you conduct your study? Did you make sure that you've included the sample size, why the sample size was chosen, the particular cell lines and animal models that you might have used, and also you want to make sure that you really concisely convey the key findings of your study. You need to emphasize what's novel, as we said before, about the work you've done, and consider the potential implications of how what you have found will help us in understanding either how something normally functions and how this might be different in a disease. Or indeed, if, for example, as I said, you've discovered something that might be a potential new therapy. If you're using animal models, then it's really important that you use the ARRIVE checklist to ensure that your scientific study is robust. And you have to be particularly careful about over-claiming the clinical significance and relevance if you have not demonstrated this. By all means, you can talk about things having an application to a disease or potential therapy, but if you're not at the stage being able to demonstrate that and you're really in the sort of preclinical basic science arena, please do avoid from doing this. And all in all, I just want to say that essentially everything that's covered before is really important. A clear, concise, well laid out abstract is what we're looking for, and will score well for a basic science abstract. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks, Laura. Next, I want to hand over to Alan Salama, who is going to talk us.
Brilliant, thanks very much. So I'm Alan Salama. I'm a nephrologist and a clinical academic at the Royal Free in London and at UCL. I'll talk about translational research. I just wanted to mention one thing which dawned on me as I was listening to Laura speaking, and just about timing of when you submit an abstract, especially if it's for a conference. There is this conflict between getting the work finished and writing an abstract that may be a little bit premature in terms of your conclusions and the findings, because you will be doing some extra work. And I guess there's two things just to say on that. Think about waiting for the next time when the research is more complete, so you've actually got a full story and you've got all your data. There's nothing more frustrating than reading an abstract that says, you know, this is potentially really exciting, but I can't show you any results and I can't show you any data, but, you know, we'll get the data by the time we will come to the conference, should it get accepted, because it tends to put people off quite a bit. So think about the timing of it. And if you are going to get more results that come through that are going to be important, maybe think about how you can present as complete a story as possible now and highlight what is due to come and in what sort of time course, but perhaps waiting a year or for the next conference. So in terms of translational research, I think here, I mean, it carries on from what Laura said, really. I think you're trying to appeal at some stages to two different audiences, and that's what can be problematic to sort of express. So you're trying to think about research, science, discovery in terms of a clinical context, most likely a much more relevant clinical context than, say, basic science concepts that Laura was talking about. So you need to make it readable both for the scientists and the clinicians, and you don't want to put anyone off who's going to get slightly bored of reading your abstract because you're either going into too much unnecessary detail or not enough details. They don't really understand what's going on. So not making it too clinical or too basic. And the example I always use for this is the sort of the complement pathway, which is phenomenally complicated, and you can get down to really nitty-gritty details of sort of sub-factors and proteins and, you know, minutiae that will put people off very, very quickly. Or you can have a sort of step back from it, not dumb it down completely, but have a higher level overview of what's going on, which allows both parties to remain interested. I think the other main thing about this is how this relates to clinical implementation. A lot of funders now will want to know what the impact of your research is, and not only what the impact is likely to be, but when it's likely to happen. So a lot of funders are talking about, will this reach clinical impact within the next 3 to 5 years? So you want to try and emphasize what the clinical consequences of this research are and how close you are to doing this. So there are some things that you might do, you want to describe, they are likely or they could ultimately result in some sort of clinical impact, but there are another 5 or 6 or 7 steps in between before that actually hits a patient. Or there might be something that will have an immediate clinical impact because it could be translated within the next couple of years. And I think it would be really important to emphasize those factors in your abstract. Next slide, please. So think about really summarizing what the clinical problem is. We've said this before about other abstracts. Of course, it's relevant for all of them, but you might want to emphasize why it's particularly important. How big a problem is it? Does it affect the individual? Does it affect the society? Is there a particular demographics that it affects, or other economic issues, or maybe all of those apply? How to bring out the scale of the problem, and if it's not something that's very common, it's very rare, that might still be very impactful because there might not be any current treatment for that. We might not have any understanding of what this rare disease is or how it happens or what we can do about it. Therefore, it's still very important and very impactful, even if only 15 people in the country get it every year. So it's really trying to grab the audience's attention when it comes to the size and the impactfulness of what you're trying to discover, or what you're trying to describe, sorry. And then I think the science of it has to be accurate and has to be well reported, but doesn't have to be overcomplicated within the abstract. You're not going to have enough space or enough time to describe that. So one of the things I think we'll come on to is AI, but just think about how readable your abstract is. And you can even put that through some search engines that tell you how readable it is. If it's overly complicated, if it's overly jargonistic, you will put some of the audience off, especially if you're trying to appeal to both scientists and clinicians who may find that more problematic. I think is that next slide? I think that's probably me done. Or should I carry on, Lisa? Carry on.
Okay. Yeah, carry on.
So clinical trials are obviously a slightly different scenario or cohort studies that a lot of people will be involved with. Here, I don't think you can really afford to put an abstract in without the full analysis of your study, unless you're simply defining the methodology you're using to describe the trial that you're going to want to do. But if you're describing the study that has already been carried out, you will really want to have most of the analysis done beforehand. And I think here, whether this is, I mean, obviously we're going to be talking about patients. It's really important to not overstate the impact of your findings, but to put it in context of who it might be affecting, how many people it might be affecting, and what the limitations are in the study that you've done as to how applicable it will be across the board, because there are many differences between small single center cohort studies and what happens when you then try and apply that outside of the of that particular center to the whole population. So there's some sort of bullet points here in terms of focusing on the cause and effect. Make sure that you understand the intervention and what impact that's had. Make sure that you clearly mark the predefined outcomes as opposed to subsequent analyses that you've done because you're trying to find statistical significance. Really important to describe the way you have, if you have randomized people, how you've selected the cohort, where you've got that cohort from and how you've reached them. So is it a sequence of patients that you've seen, the last 100 patients that have come to your particular centre? Have you split them up according to some other some way of segmenting them into different groups? Really important that that's highlighted from the outset so that people understand exactly what you're talking about. Highlight, as has been said before, that using the consort checklist, think about highlighting it in the title, whether it's a randomised, placebo-controlled trial, whether it's a cohort study, whether it's a different sort of study that you've carried out, a retrospective or an in silico study, something else that you could put in the title that allows people to understand it from the very, very outset as to how you've done it and what's been done. And I think the other thing to really think about is the statistical significance can be achieved for lots of different outcome measures. Whether it's a biologically important outcome or not is something you should try and emphasize. So you can find small differences, but does that really mean it makes much of a difference to the patient? Again, if you find that there is a biologically significant outcome, it's well worth highlighting that. And then we all do it, and especially if it's cohort studies from single centres. How have you assessed for adverse events or safety? Have you done this rigorously, or is this a retrospective analysis of it? And make sure that you include that, because anyone who doesn't put any adverse effects and says this is absolutely without any problems is not really going to be believable. And I think at that point I'll stop and hand over to the next person.
Thanks. So next I'd like to introduce Courtney Lightfoot, who will discuss qualitative and mixed methods research abstracts for us.
Thanks, Dane. So I'm Courtney Lightfoot. I'm a mixed methods researcher from the University of Leicester. So I'm going to cover qualitative and mixed methods, but it's going to predominantly focus on the qualitative abstracts, and then I'll briefly summarise the mixed methods because all of the quantitative stuff has already been covered elsewhere in this session. So for a qualitative abstract, we're summarising a research study that uses qualitative methods, whether this is interviews, focus groups, observations. It generally tends to explore people's experiences, perceptions, feelings, or social processes in depth. It focuses on the understanding meanings and context rather than measuring quantities or testing hypotheses. And then for mixed methods, we describe the integration of how we bring qualitative and quantitative approaches together within a study. And we explain why combining these methods adds value rather than just having one or the other. And you obviously present both types of findings together, but you also want to highlight how these complement each other. Next slide, please. And within all of these slides, I have got some examples, which I'm not going to have time to go through today, but you can go back and have a look at them. But these kind of highlight the key points on the slides. There's obviously other components that you should include within abstracts, which have already been covered at the start of the session. So for a title, we want to really focus on reflect the focus of the study, particularly indicating the qualitative nature of this. We want to include key elements such as the population that we're exploring, the topic or the experience that we're studying. We want to include the method or the approaches, so the qualitative approaches that we're using. Often we tend to use engaging and descriptive languages and try and highlight experience, meaning, or perspectives. Next slide, please. For the introduction, the background and aim, you want to clearly state your research aim like all other abstracts, but we tend to want to use terms like explore, understand, or investigate to reflect the qualitative intent. You also want to clarify why you're using a qualitative approach and how this aligns to your research aim. So you want to say why you're exploring like people's experiences or how they perceive something or how someone makes sense of a phenomenon. You want to consider specifying the guiding theoretical framework or research paradigm in which you're basing your qualitative study. Next slide, please. For the methods, you want to specify the methodological approach, whether this is inductive or interpretive in nature. You want to describe what you're using, so like whether you're using phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, case study, for example. You also want to include your sampling strategy, so whether this is purposive, convenience, or snowballing. You want to describe the techniques that you're using, whether this is interviews, focus groups, observations, or document analysis. You also want to explain your analysis strategy, so what type of analysis that you're using to analyse the data. You want to describe how you're collating your themes or categories, how they were identified, whether they were inductive, so whether they were data-driven, or whether they're deductive, whether they're theory-driven. You want to describe these methods and the processes for coding these responses. And then you also want to describe how you've categorised your themes and how you've named your themes. And you also want to consider addressing the trustworthiness and rigour by outlining strategies that you may have used, such as member check-in, reflexivity, or triangulation. Next slide, please. There's just an example, so I'll skip over that. Thank you. So for the findings, you want to highlight the key findings. So you want to present the central themes or patterns that you've identified within your data. It's really important to try and use thematic language. So phrases, conceptual insights, and not just descriptive observations. You want to use illustrative phrasing. So you want to try and echo the participant's voice. They're not your words. You want to try and use their words. You want to try and briefly interpret each theme and go beyond just the surface description by briefly indicating what the themes actually mean or what they imply. You want to ensure that your findings flow logically and link back to your research question and your methodology. So you want to think back to what your core concept is. What are you actually trying to explore and find out? And you want to try and weave your findings into a brief narrative. Try and avoid listing them as bullet points. Next slide, please. There's just an example of how to do that. And so for the discussion and the conclusion, you want to explain the significance of the findings and demonstrate their relevance and impact. You want to discuss the implications for clinical practice, service delivery, education, or health policy, and consider the relevance to future research. You also want to acknowledge and reflect on the study's strengths and limitations and be transparent about what these are. You also want to discuss the transferability of the findings and avoid claims of generalizability. So how might your findings translate to like another disease or another population within the disease? You want to consider reflexivity. So you want to critically reflect and acknowledge your role and your perspectives and how this might have influenced the data collection, analysis, and interpretation. And you want to conclude your discussion with a clear statement about what your findings mean and why they matter. Next slide, please. And there's just an example of how you might do this. So some other considerations when writing qualitative abstracts. So you want to use interpretive and reflective language. You want to avoid overly statistical or quantitative phrasings. So we tend to use phrasings such as participants express, or this suggests, or reflecting a sense of. You want to centre your abstract around participants' perspectives. You want to highlight their views and their experiences. You also want to acknowledge the subjectivity within this, so how you may influence the data. And you also may want to include indirect quotes or paraphrase your data to convey in a participant's voice. And you want to ensure that the tone of your abstract reflects the interpretive depth and not measurement precision. So you want to prioritise the depth and insight over the quantity, so focus on meanings rather than numbers. And you want to recognise the complexity and nuance, so avoid overgeneralising, describing contextual factors, and you want to acknowledge ambiguity and uncertainty. And there's a fine balance between the description and the interpretation. And again, like all the others, there are checklists that you can use to help you, and that it's kind of either or for those. Thank you. Next slide. And then so for mixed methods, just to try and bring it all together. So obviously I've discussed the qualitative components, and then others have talked about the quantitative components. So you want to state the purpose of your study and why mixing the methods together are needed. You want to highlight how each of the methods contribute to answering the research question. And you want to describe which quantitative and qualitative research methods that you've used, and mention your sample size, data collection, and your analysis techniques for both qualitative and quantitative. And then you should try and integrate the findings and show how they complement or explain each other, and try and avoid treating them as two separate things. If you plan on treating them as two separate things, you should be submitting two separate abstracts. And you want to highlight the significance and implications of combining these different insights together. Next slide. Thank you. I think that might be it actually for me. Yeah, thank you.
Lovely, thanks, Courtney. So next I'd like to hand over to Rosie Donne, who's going to talk us through quality improvement.
Thanks, Lisa. So I'm a consultant nephrologist in Salford Royal in Greater Manchester and one of the two KQIP co-leads, so the QI arm of UK Kidney Association. And we lead and assist teams in some national QI programs as well as regional or local QI projects. So quality improvement abstract is sometimes a little bit of a different way of writing. We're very much summarising a project that's looked at the real world intervention and how we've tried to improve care of patients, or possibly something to do with the way staff work, looking at healthcare processes, patient outcomes, or maybe safety. And in quality improvement, we're often focusing on understanding the problem first, and then working at how we can test in cycles of change. Test one thing, measure the outcome, tweak it again, test it again, and then measuring things along the way. So we want to be able to understand our local context and be able to measure the impact of changes that we're doing. And importantly, in quality improvement, it's probably 80% about how people do things. And a lot of quality improvement is about making it easy for people to do the thing that they know they should be doing a lot of the time. So we often call this human factors. And a lot of quality improvement work is exploring what those human factors are on the ground that make us either do the right thing or maybe not do the right thing. And what were the things that we implemented during a project and tested to actually see if these shifted those human factors in the right direction. Next slide, please. So quality improvement often focuses on these three questions. You'll see it on the right-hand side in that little infographic there. So what is the aim of the project, or what are we trying to accomplish? Secondly, how will we know if a change is actually an improvement? So that comes down to how we measure things. And then what changes can we make that will lead to an improvement? So that comes down to sort of having ideas as a team and testing those changes as we go along. And we often test those in what's called PDSA cycles, or Plan, Do, Study, Act, which I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of. Next slide, please. So luckily we have the Squire guidelines and checklist, which is really helpful in putting together a QI abstract and presenting that as a journal article as well. So well worth looking up those, but I'm just pulling out some of those things when talking about the structure of an abstract. So firstly, with the introduction, this is really going to talk about why did you start doing the QI work? Describe the problem that you have compared to perhaps national standards or guidance. You may be aware that there's a big difference between what you do at the moment to look after patients in a particular area and what's recommended. Why is it important? And it's really important in quality improvement to have a clearly defined SMART aim, so specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. I'm sure many of you have come across that acronym. And then moving on to the methods. So what did you actually do? So in quality improvement, it's really important that you describe what QI methodologies you used, first of all, to understand the problem, and then the cycles of change. So in understanding the problem, we may use a variety of tools, including process mapping, root cause analysis, it may be surveys of patients and staff, and various other techniques. So it's important to describe those in the methods. It's also good to show how you involve patients in your work. Hopefully with most QI projects, you would involve patients throughout, but certainly at the beginning to understand their perspectives. And also the same for what you've done to understand the human factors involved. And then further on in the methods, you're going to summarize the cycles of change. So it's really good to kind of list these. So first you did this, you measure the output, you tweak things, then you did this, and then you did this, and then you did this. And what that implies is you need to be keeping a journal of that activity as you're actually doing the project, because we often forget these cycles of change and we just come to the end and we think, oh, we know the system is better now. But actually, if we haven't captured that activity as we've gone along during the project, you may struggle to describe what those cycles of change were, because the project may have lasted many months or even a couple of years. And it's really important in your methods to show how you've gone about measuring the impact of that change. So what did you measure and how? Next slide, please. So then describing your results, it's really important to use what we call baseline data. So you may have carried out an audit or some kind of data collection to see what your level of achievement of a certain standard was before you made the changes. And then it's important to display your data over time. And that's one of the crucial things of QI projects and abstracts, is we want to show the data over time to actually show whether what you did made any changes, and if so, was it in the right direction. And it's best done if it's done on charts. You can see this run chart on the bottom right-hand corner. So the baseline data is on the left-hand side. You can see, say, if this was number of live donor transplants per month, things are fluctuating up and down, but they're not really changing in the right direction. Then a change was made. So we've annotated that graph to show us where change number 1 happened, and that caused an increase in the monthly number of live donor transplants. Then we can see change 2 was implemented, but actually it didn't really seem to make any difference. So it's very important to annotate those charts. And sometimes good things happen, but also sometimes there are unintended consequences, which may be good or bad. So it's really important to put those into the results as well, because the reader can learn just as much from those unintended consequences, which may apply very much in their setting. So not to just gloss over those. Next slide. So pulling it all together into the discussion, so what does this actually mean for patients or staff or the organisation? What was the impact? How can the improvement be sustained? We often encourage people to use a certain tool to assess the sustainability of the work during the project, but certainly when you're coming to present it in an abstract, you want to give some kind of assessment of how sustainable it is, and usually there are some deficits there. So what work should be done to make that success more sustainable over time? It's also useful to include an assessment of the equity of the improvements. Did it actually improve all patient groups, or was one ethnic group or geographical area left out in terms of those improvements? It's also good to reflect on whether these improvements could be generalized to other settings. People always want to lift and shift a QI project into their area and think it's all going to work just the same, and that's often not the case, either because of the human factors involved or the various different unique characteristics of that healthcare setting, which may mean that doing exactly the same thing as described in someone's QI report may or may not have the same impact in another setting. And then just to summarize what you feel the next steps would be in that QI project, perhaps to take it to the next level or indeed make it more sustainable. I think that's the end of me.
Brilliant, thank you. Now Hilary Corwin is going to talk to us about abstracts for observational research, and then also the use of AI in aiding abstract writing.
Thank you, Dan. Hi, I'm Hilary Corwin. I'm the Education Project Manager for the UK Kidney Association. I'm also an economist. I just want to talk very quickly about observational research, as we've touched on other types of typically experimental or interventional types of quantitative research. Observational research is unique in that it's summarizing a study where you're analyzing data without introducing an intervention. So this can be epidemiology studies, cohort, case control, cross-sectional studies, some economic evaluations. Because you're not introducing an intervention, you're not leveraging the kind of statistical power of the experimental setup and randomization. It's really important in this observational research not to claim any kind of causality. So we need to be cautious about any interpretation of our results from these kind of studies. So this focuses on describing associations, trends, or patterns rather than cause and effect relationships. And this is often looking at real-world settings, populations, and quite often in cases when we can't, or it would either be not feasible or not ethical to use a randomized control trial. So similar to other types of quantitative research, when you're doing observational research and writing up the abstract for it, make sure you say what type of study type you're using, either in your title or quite early on in your abstract. Talk about the design. Be sure to cover what the setting is, so like the time and place of the study, the population you're looking at, any selection that went into determining which groups you're studying. Your primary variables, your primary outcome, and explanatory variables. And talk about your data sources, especially if you're pulling from a novel or underused data source. Very briefly explain what it is, where it's coming from. Talk about how you've analyzed the data. Present your estimates with confidence intervals. You want to see not only the estimate of, what this relationship is, but also the level of uncertainty around those estimates. Discuss your key findings and keep in mind here the limitations and the generalizability, the scope of how generalizable your research is. Talk about what the implications are. Quite often with an observational research design, you're looking at something that has an ethical or an equity consideration. Talk about those in your abstract. They're really important, especially in a healthcare setting. And talk about what the impact is on patients' policy or practice. In a lot of ways, this has a lot of overlap with other types of quantitative research. And here there are a couple different checklists that you can use that are on that kind of in that broader set. The STROBE is used for epidemiology, CHEERS for economic health evaluations. Very quickly, I kind of want to sum up what you've heard so far. So what the big takeaway on the abstracts is. Abstracts should clearly state your aim or hypothesis. They should summarize your methods and key findings. They should highlight what's novel. And I can't emphasize this enough, especially for getting into conferences and getting your work published. Make sure you drive home that point of what's new about your research and why it's important. Explain why it matters. In your conclusion, make sure you talk about broader relevance, but don't overclaim relevance outside of what you've done. It's a big red flag for reviewers. Follow a logical structure. Don't get creative on this. You've got checklists. That's what people are expecting, and it kind of helps them read through. Be clear and concise. Tailor your abstracts to the type of study that you're doing. You can do this using the checklists that we've talked about. You can use this using the resources that are going to pair with this pair with the recorded version of this. And also look at similar published examples to what you're doing. So if you find research that's similar to yours, it's been published, that's met the standard, look at what they've done and kind of mold what you're doing off of that. And a good abstract should stand alone. I should have a very good idea of what you've done and why it matters based on your abstract alone. I shouldn't have to go to your talk. I shouldn't have to read your full paper. But it should kind of coax me into it if it's something that I should be interested in. Okay, so that covers that. I want to talk very briefly about using generative AI. So we acknowledge that some people are going to use AI at this point. And we want to make sure that if you are, you're using it appropriately and you're using it well. So AI can be very useful, but it can also be fairly dangerous. So this is because AI has been designed to please users. That means that it will very confidently return an answer even when there is no answer. It will say yes, absolutely, even when the answer is no. And it'll reinforce these affirmations with things that are seemingly factual, but instead are fabricated. And so any use of AI needs to have significant human oversight. Use it as a tool, don't use it to replace thought. And so if you're using generative AI technologies to help with your abstract writing, you can use it for checking and improving grammar and clarity. I think it's quite good for that. Checking alignment with the abstract criteria and best practices. It can help you spot things that you think you've done that you haven't. If you give it kind of a reviewer type role and you give it the criteria that it's reviewing your abstract on, it can help kind of flag any problems that are in there. Use readability tools. These are especially useful for lay summaries and patient information where you want to make sure that you're not going over a certain reading age. AI and readability tools can be great for these things. That being said, you absolutely need to write and review your abstract independently of AI in the first instance. Don't use it to do any thinking for you. Anything you do ask it to do, make sure you're checking very closely. Any output from the AI, read through it, make sure it makes sense, make sure it is in fact what you meant. As I alluded to a moment ago, AI can be hallucinating, which is presenting inaccurate or fabricated information as factual. Even if you ask it to produce citations, the citations can be falsified. It can give you links to things that don't exist. It can say things that are in those links that aren't there. And it does all of these things to kind of bolster these hallucinated claims. Do not use AI to think for you. Don't use it to, pull together a literature review or engage in any way with that kind of thing. Which brings us to what we do not want you to use AI for. Do not use it to generate original content. Don't use it to conduct analysis. Absolutely do not use AI to write your abstract for you. Use AI to help you write the abstract. And in the next couple of slides, these will be on the website for you to download. I've got some examples of prompts that you can use. So these are prompts that could help you check for your grammar and clarity. The bottom bolded part, I can't emphasize enough. Any suggestions that AI returns may or may not be improvements. So make sure you're using your judgment. And also including prompts on checking against guidelines and translating abstracts into lay summaries. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Dane. Thank you.
Thanks. So next slide, please. So now thinking about the process of writing an abstract, a strong final product doesn't just happen, it's the result of a thoughtful and strategic writing process. So first, plan early. Don't leave your abstract to the last minute, take note of your deadlines, understand the submission structure, and be aware of word limits. Planning ahead gives you the time you need to refine your message, and it makes the writing much less stressful. Second, learn from published examples. Go and read abstracts from conferences or journals that are in your field. Look at which ones are clear and engaging and informative, and which ones fall a bit flat. Use them as models. Notice how they structure information and what tone they use and how they highlight their contributions. Thirdly, draft iteratively. Don't expect your first version to be perfect, and in fact your first draft should be rough, and that's okay. The goal is to get ideas down quickly, then revise for clarity, precision, and impact. Abstracts are short, but that makes every word matter even more. So expect to go through several drafts. Next, keep it structured, informative, and concise. Use tools like checklists to make sure you're covering the right elements. The ones that we've been discussing today are the Equator guidelines. And if you're submitting to something like the UK Kidney Week conference, be sure to follow their submission format and their requirements. Include only what's essential. You don't need every detail, just ones that help tell your research story. And use your most impactful tables or figures. If there's one visual that tells your whole story, then definitely include it. Many conferences now allow supplemental uploads with your abstract, and these can really help cut down on your word limit, but still give a lot of detail from your research. Avoid generic or vague conclusions. Don't end with something like more research is needed. Instead, say what your results show and what they suggest. And finally, ask for help. Make sure you've agreed on authorship early on, and that all co-authors have reviewed and approved the abstract. This will help avoid any confusion and strengthen the final version. And crucially, get a fresh pair of eyes. Ask a colleague who wasn't involved in the project to read it. They can point out unclear phrasing, missing content, or any assumptions that you might not realize you're making. Writing a good abstract is as much about communication as it is about the content, so give yourself the time, the tools, and the feedback you need to do it well. So next slide, please. So this is the last one from me. We've mentioned several times using conference marking criteria to build your abstract. So here's the one for UKKA scoring. You can use these criteria as practical guides to ensure the quality and impact. So when if you're submitting to Kidney Week, ask yourself, is it clear and well structured? Make sure your objectives, methods and results are easy to follow, logically linked, clearly stated. Is it original and relevant? Highlight what's new, why it matters, how it advances knowledge or improves kidney care, safety or efficiency. And finally, is it high quality and credible? So align your work with established research or improvement standards and make sure it's reproducible and sustainable. And the final tip is use these criteria as checklists during writing, not just at the submission. It increases your chances of acceptance and ensures your work makes a meaningful contribution. So I'm going to hand back over to Lisa now, who'll do a final slide for us. But before I do, just make sure you start putting some questions into the chat, just so that we can kick things off when we move on to that part.
Lovely, thank you. So just thinking about some other ways that you can get support with your abstract writing. So thinking about your professional bodies, so, you know, Royal College Nursing, Chartered Society of Physiotherapists, Royal College of Occupational Therapists, quite often they will have information on their websites, or there might be mentors that you can link into, people to read your work who understand what you're doing. The same about thinking about professional groups. So within the UKKA, there's a lot of different groups there. And again, I know groups like ANUK, I think, have an offer where people can bring their abstract to the group and get some feedback on it. So using everything that you can tap into. Special interest groups, again, might be a good way if you've got a specific topic, just to get some feedback from people who understand that topic and give you a bit of guidance. Any university or trust supports that you have, but also thinking about friends and family as well. I know when I write abstracts, I will get my family to read it. They have no idea about kidney disease whatsoever, but at least they could just have a look at the readability, and sometimes they can just pick up some of the easy mistakes that I've missed, especially things like grammar and punctuation and things like that. So I think just think outside the box of all the different ways that you can tap into support. And then the UKK and UK Kidney Week have a lot of resources to tap into, and obviously we're constantly building on that. So the Kidney Week website already has some resources on it to help with submission, and that is being looked at, and more resources are being generated. So we will be sending out communications and letting people know when they come out, but do have a look what's already there. We are also hoping to run a practical session at Kidney Week in 2026. So just a bit of a plug if you want to come along to that. And that's part of the feedback that we want to get from you today, really, is to think about from this webinar what has been really helpful or you want a little bit more information on, but also what have we not covered that you think is really important. And then we'll use that to help shape the practical session or any other resources that we think that we need to be developing. So if you do have any feedback, you can email that through to Hilary, who's popped her email address down there. And just as I said at the start, this webinar is recorded, so you'll be able to go back and watch it. Or for anybody who wasn't able to join live today, we'll be able to watch it back, and the slides as well. So that QR code will take you through to the Education Hub, where it should be there towards the end of the week. And then next slide. And so, I mean, we're really hoping that the tips and hints that we've kind of given today are helping you with all aspects of writing abstracts, whether that's for publication or any other conferences. But also, we also would very much like people to be having this in mind and submitting things for our UK Kidney Week, which is in March in Harrogate next year. So submissions are open currently for abstracts, and that closes, I think it's on the 19th of September. So this QR code will take you through to that submission. So do keep that in mind, and we're hoping this webinar was well timed to give you a little bit of confidence to put your work through for that. So that's the end of our kind of bulk of information. So we do have a decent amount of time for questions now. So we really want the second part of this webinar to be an interactive session responding. So do please pop in the chat and we'll be reading through. I guess just to get things started, I was just going to open it up to the panel that we have. If anybody has any specific tips or tricks or hints that they use when they're putting their own abstracts through. Anyone wants to jump in?
I would say from the QI perspective, it's really begin with the end in mind. So a lot of us embark on quality improvement work and we're not really thinking about how we're going to share it in the long run. But obviously your work's going to be much more impactful if you share it beyond your own department. But that requires quite a lot of discipline as you're doing the work in terms of working out how you're going to measure the changes, collecting data as you go along about the cycles of changes, keeping a kind of a log of what you're doing and why, and all the different things that you made. So I guess the summary is begin with the end in mind with all of that.
Yeah, that's a good tip.
Just going to follow on from that and say I usually start with my results. I usually write my results first, and then my discussion, and then my methods, and then my intro. Slightly backwards. But
yeah, no, that's a good tip.
It gives you the most amount for the thing that people are most interested in.
Perfect. Any other hot tips?
I would just say less is more. So sometimes not trying to cram it with a ton of information and keeping it relatively simple and readable, including the title. So I think any title that has more than about 10 words in it is already slightly too long. So less is more.
Yeah.
I was just acronyms. Acronyms are the worst thing for an abstract, because you in your very precise field will know what you're talking about, but your acronym quite often will match somebody else's acronym and you will not be understanding the same thing, and it makes things really difficult. So that's my top tip. Avoid them, no matter if it's science, clinical, or any other type of abstract. Please make sure you remove them because it makes it much easier for readability.
Yeah, perfect. And I think it's just getting started. I think the hardest thing with anything is just getting that first draft down. And I think because it is so tight with the word count, what I usually do is I'll just write something and it will usually be way over the word count. But then as you go back and revise, and I think because of the word count, it almost forces you to then pick out what's important to focus on and be concise, because you have to start getting, working out what you're going to cut. And then it really helps you, I guess, focus on what the important things you want to say is when you realize that you have to cut out 400 words. So I think just get something down and then start revising and seeing where you go. Dane, have we got any questions coming through?
Yes, so the first one has come in from Jazz Kiran, so I can answer this a little bit. So is there a maximum number of tables or figures to submit? So for example, can we submit 3 if deemed impactful? Sometimes you have to look at how many you're allowed to submit from the abstract guidelines. I think the most I've ever done is 2. I don't know what the UK Kidney Week guidelines allow you to do. Hilary, I don't know if you know that, but what does the panel think is too much?
I don't think there's a number. I think it depends what the quality of the image is that you're trying, how important it is. You might not need it. I think people tend to put, for example, a good example is tables. People tend to put in a lot of tables in their abstract, which is not very readable, and actually doesn't necessarily, you can convey some of the conclusions from that table in a couple of sentences, which might be easier. So is it really necessary? I think I would ask myself, and what is the best way to convey that information? Is it a graph? Are there different sorts of graphs that you might want to use rather than the sort of standard ones, or is it a table, or is it something else? But is it the best way to convey the information you're trying to deliver?
Perfect. Okay, so seeing what else we've come through. So we've got a question here. So for a literature review, what type of abstract would it fall under? I mean, before any of the panel come through, I guess one thing to say as well is that we're just giving a bit of a range of different abstract types that have, I guess, specific things that you want to be thinking about. You're not having to necessarily label what your abstract is when you submit it. It's just things to consider the type of abstract. So it's not as if you have to pick which heading you're submitting something under. Thinking about a literature review, and again, anyone jump in if they have anything else to say, I would be just thinking what it is that you're trying to convey from that literature review, because why have you done it and what is the question that you're trying to answer, and then that might help you work out kind of what area you're thinking towards. I'm not sure if anyone else on the panel has any other thoughts on that one, but I think it's just thinking about in general with any abstract, what is it that you're trying to convey? What were you using the literature review for? What was your question? And making sure that you're conveying that in your abstract.
So the next question we've got, and Laura, this might be one for you. How do you convey the so what or impact for basic science projects where they might be a long way off patient impact?
Well, I think with this one, nobody does science without having a good question to ask, you know what I mean? So you'll be set out to do a study, and maybe it might feel very far away from patients. That doesn't matter. You know, you might be looking at an individual cell and you might be understanding new ways it functions that weren't known before, but that's still exciting and it's still novel and it's still important, because one of the things is you're providing an increase of our foundational knowledge. And okay, the immediate clinical impact of that might not be known, but the fact that knowledge is now out there means other people can start to build upon what you found. So I don't think you should get too hung up about that. I think what you need to do is very elegantly explain why you're interested in this fundamental process and what the potential implications of that are. And also to say that quite often scientists look at the normal, like what's the normal physiology? How do things normally function? Because in actual fact, we don't know everything yet. And then we can start to think about how this might be altered in pathophysiology or when somebody has a particular disease. So I think the key to a good abstract is putting down what's novel about your work in terms of science abstract, explaining what potential this might have in the future without going and overestimating or over-concluding what the clinical impact would be. So I think don't worry about it. We're still interested in fundamental science, and you can convey it very nicely in your abstract, explaining the novelty, and we will not dismiss an abstract if it doesn't have an immediate clinical translation, because in actual fact, we're interested in good quality science around the kidney area.
Thank you. Okay, I wonder, Rosie, if you want to comment on the next question, which is, how can you not overstate the conclusion, but convey that the work is useful, at least in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, I guess we have to sort of use proportionate language to really say what we think has been discovered. I think sometimes we feel like we've been working on something for such a long time that it must be so important and everyone must be equally as interested as we are. So we have to try and be a little bit objective as well. And I guess that's why sometimes it's good to sort of run these things past patients who might have been involved, because we might think something's really important and the patient may or may not agree. So if it's important to patients and they're telling us that it is, then I guess that gives you a lot more certainty that actually this is something that's really important.
Thanks. Here's a question. So should your abstract be worded for lay or clinical/science audiences? So I think this one might be a little bit about what you're submitting it to. What's anyone else's opinions?
I was going to say, like, the people marking it are generally like clinical scientists, but I think it still needs to have that lay element, so actually kind of anybody can understand it. You want it to be as clear and concise as possible, and don't want to make it too complex, otherwise it makes it too difficult to read and understand.
I mean, I guess the other thing is that not everyone will be an expert in your area who's reviewing it. So you do want to make it very readable across a sort of general audience. I mean, you can use technical terms. Obviously, you might have to use technical jargon, but I think you should try and keep that to a bare minimum. You should still be able to describe the problem that you're addressing and how you've attempted to solve it without having to go into too much technical detail. I mean, obviously, if you're describing basic science mechanisms and you have to talk about molecules and how they interact and so on, then you can't get around that. But I think I'm always slightly surprised if you put your, not just abstracts, but text into a readability tool and see how complex it actually is. The level of understanding for most of the text that we generate is at the level of a sort of university graduate. If you're trying to appeal to lay people, the recommendations are really that you're trying to get it towards school children's age. So we are so far off making this simple for the most part. It's a good exercise to do for, I think, people just to take some text that they've written, whether it's for a paper or an abstract or something else, put it into a readability tool and see what sort of age or level of education they're actually reaching. And you'll find that you're generally overstating it quite a lot, and it can be simplified to a great extent.
Okay, the next question I think I can answer. So are we allowed to use AI to streamline the words? So I think that's fine. As Hilly was saying, it's not you've written something and you're just asking AI to help you fit it into your word count or to make it a little bit more concise. That's fine. You've written the original content. You're not asking it to create anything. So I think that's a good use of AI just to help you.
So our next question is around, are you allowed to submit an abstract to more than one conference?
So I can answer a little bit. So often it will tell you if you're allowed to do that. So some conferences will specifically state in their guidelines for their abstract, they will not accept abstracts that have been published or seen at another conference. So it tends to be that is very clear in the guidelines for them. I think typical best practice is you wouldn't put exactly the same abstract into any more than one meeting, but it may be that you put one in and you build upon it for the second abstract, or you maybe, as Alan alluded to earlier, you're sort of halfway through a project and you've done an abstract, and then maybe you'll put a more fuller abstract together later on when you've completed a study. But do be mindful, the registration and the abstract submission websites tell you if you're allowed to put in exactly the same one, but it isn't generally thought to be best practice to do that.
And is that the same for if you're submitting for a publication and a conference?
Typically for a conference, depends again on the audience. So if I'm submitting an abstract for a paper, it will look quite different to what I've often put into an abstract, because it will be what I'm using to get people to read my paper. So it tends to be, I think, a little bit more plain English, a little bit more punchy in terms of, how I've written it. And it will not have often as much depending on how I'm doing, so, thinking about, I've got a whole method section in my paper, so I'll maybe have a little bit less, just the highlights of how I did the study, what the key findings were, what the impactful results I got were, but the rest of the panels may have slightly different views.
Thanks.
Okay, so next question. So what about a case study or a clinical case submission as an abstract? So that is not a problem to be submitted those. I guess you're still just going back to asking your question, what is novel? Why is this case study or this clinical case important? And it is one of the drop-down boxes when you go onto the UK Kidney Week website. It has some additional advice on different submissions and some guidance, and case study is one of those. And I think there's the acronym is CARE guidelines, and it gives you some information about what to include. But I think, as I said, with any kind of topic, it's just making sure you're thinking about what's important about this information that I want to convey, what makes why does it matter? Why do people want to know this information?
I'm just looking through. I don't think there's any more questions on the chat. Is there anyone that wants to put any last minute ones in?
We won't keep people if we've answered most of the burning questions. As I said, we do have the email address that will be on the slides when you go back and look at them. So as I said, the main things is any feedback, anything that we haven't covered that you want to see future resources or information on. But if you do think of any other questions, or for anybody who is not watching this live and is watching this back, if you have any questions, then feel free to email them through, and we can always have that as one of the resources that we upload later as well, just compiling a bit of a frequently asked questions and try and get some answers to them. So so we've just had last minute questions come through. So can you provide us feedback scores so we know how to improve in the future? So it's a bit of a difficult one because we obviously get so many submissions coming through. We usually get 500 or so we can't unfortunately automatically get back to everybody with feedback. I think that's one of the things where it's about tapping into the resources that you have around you. So talking, if you have a mentor or a peer or somebody that you can talk to ask for feedback on your presentation or your abstract, that can be really helpful. And I think some of the advice that we saw in the slides as well was just starting to read other people's abstracts as well. I think just almost socializing yourself into that type of language and that kind of setup is helpful. If you really want some support, you can email through and we can see if we can get the feedback to you, but unfortunately we can't, as standard, get back to everybody just from the sheer volume of abstracts that we come through. But tap into the resources around you, and I think that would be helpful.
Or I suppose, Lisa, come to your live writing event if at UKKW.
Yes.
Get real feedback there, particularly if it's something that you're concerned about or you want some extra hints and tips. That might be something really useful for you to attend.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the idea is, as I said, with the resources that we build up as well, we'll try and see if we can get some examples of really well written abstracts, and maybe some abstracts that are highlighting when something's maybe not gone to plan or is not as clear, so that you've got some examples of things to avoid and good examples as well. And just thinking, so I guess when we're thinking about abstracts as well, there's the two sides of it. So there's the abstract submission and then there's the abstract marking side as well. So as I said, from the UK Kidney Week point of view and the UKKA point of view, there's a lot of focus on this area at the moment to try and make this whole process as robust as possible, as well as supporting the community as much as possible. So we're doing work like this to try and support people with building their skills to submit high quality abstracts, but we are also looking at the abstract marking side of it as well, and making sure that we've got good systems in place to make sure that the markers know what is expected of them, and that we get the same marking across multiple people doing that. So we're looking at the marking criteria and the advice that we give to the markers as well. And I guess the other thing to say is, we've spoken about all the different types of abstracts. So not everybody can mark every type of abstract. We all have our areas of specialty that we know. So part of it as well is making sure that we have a rounded group of people volunteering. So every year calls go out for people to volunteer to be abstract markers for Kidney Week. So it is something to consider if you know somebody who might be interested, because we want to make sure that we've got good representation across all the different professions, different types of abstracts, because that's part of the battle as well, making sure that we've got the right people to mark the right abstracts. But we are having a look at the marking criteria as well. So hopefully that all comes together as we go forward to make the whole process really robust. Okay. I can't see anything more coming in, so I think we'll wrap up today's session. So thank you to all of our speakers for coming today and providing all of your expert knowledge in all the different areas. And I think it just showcases how varied it is, and why it is so important that we do have a look at the differences as well as the similarities between abstract marking. And thank you to all of our attendees as well. As I said, if the link to go back and watch or to access the slides should be there by the end of the week. And do please provide us any feedback so we can keep building our resources as we go. But otherwise, thank you very much for your attendance today, and we will close it there.